Good evening, good evening. It's Jade Simmons here. I'm your one and only true independent candidate for President of the United States in this year's 2020 election. Tonight, we're bringing you a special edition of the Daily Debrief. This is where I share with you not only what's happening in the news today, because you're well aware of what's happening, but I like to take the time to give you not only my worldview, but my view of how I see you as American citizens. What I've been saying over and over again is that we must demand an era now where our leadership 100% of the time is prioritizing people over profit, people over party, people over hyper-partisanship. We are looking at an era that is going to require new solutions. We cannot get there doing the same thing we've always done, electing the same type of officials that we've always elected. If you want to learn more about Operation Restoration, which is the movement powering this campaign, you're going to go to operationrestoration2020.com. This is a special edition of the Daily Debrief. I've been giving you viewpoints, as much expert research as we can find and muster for the last few weeks, as long as we've been together weathering COVID-19. Tonight is a special edition. I'm bringing on one of my own healthcare advisors, again, Dr. Carolyn Richardson. You saw her in the healthcare listening to our session a week or so ago. What is important to me is that we have a nation now that becomes known as being the most informed, the most globally informed nation on the planet. What I mean by that is we no longer are hunkering down behind party lines. We're deciding now that it is important. It is the most American thing we can do to gather information from as many sources as possible, and then let us reason the information together. I've also promised you unprecedented transparency. I have a very strong stance where the reopening is concerned. I've felt like, and still feel like, we have opened, not even so much about being too soon, but we've opened without the proper solutions in place in advance. We've also been unclear and uncertain and all over the place where the solutions offered are concerned. Case in point today, my family and I, we live in Texas, and the governor said that we were reopening, that parks and these things were open. So we went out today with our kids, and we went to a place where there were really not many others. We determined to keep practicing social distancing. And after about 5 minutes, the local police pulled up and said, hey, you got to clear this area. And so me wanting to know why, because I know that our governor just told us we were able to come outside, I went up to that police officer, and she informed me, well, while the governor said one thing, the local government is saying this, or the local school district is saying that you cannot be on their property, you cannot be on their parks, you cannot be in the neighborhood parks. So already there's so much confusion. So if we're going to reopen powerfully, I've been saying we needed to have a certain amount of tests every day. And one of my biggest concerns as someone who is determined to prioritize people over profit every time is that we don't think of people and the economy as two different entities, that people are the economy. And if we want to open powerfully, safely, and for the long term, we have to prioritize the health and safety of the people, because that is the stance. It is now my duty to continue to watch the information and see if anything changes, and it has. So I'm going to be transparent with you tonight and tell you where I am changing on my stances, because I believe it's important now for leadership not to stay in one place out of pride because they don't want to look like they're changing their mind. It is important now for humility to reign, in the sense that we are humble enough to continue to take in new information. You'll hear from my guests that whenever you're looking at a novel virus, the very word novel means new, right? If you haven't really been thinking about it, that literally, it really means new. So we discover new things. One of the promises that I'm making you as we begin the process of planning to pandemic-proof the nation is that we are always giving you information at the height of the intelligence, the height of the most available intelligence, never just shooting from our hip. But as that intelligence changes, we must evolve with the information. So Carolyn's going to come on tonight. We're also going to talk about some truths that I said a few weeks ago we had to be on the lookout for. I said we're entering an era where I felt it would be revealed some hard truths, as well as some hidden truths, Some things that have been intentionally hidden will now start to show themselves. And I also said we should be prepared to, excuse me, to receive some new truths. What I mean by that is because of the abundance now of innovation and discovery, we're going to find out things that either we thought were true that are no longer true, and that's a good thing. We want to make sure you have the most recent truth so that you can make decisions accordingly. So get ready to hear from Dr. Carolyn Richardson. She is a walking encyclopedia. I'll let her tell you more about some of her specializations, but she'll lead us tonight in a very eye-opening discussion. Please welcome Dr. Carolyn Richardson. Hey, Carolyn, I think you're still muted there. Let me see if we have your, don't worry. There you are. You're good there. How are you?
I'm just fine. Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity, and I'd just like to say good evening to everyone who is watching this event. We talked about one of the things that was going on with this novel virus is that whenever you have a new situation, you apply what you know from previous or similar situations. And then as events unfold, you may find some things are working and some things are not working. And one of the things that this was most important about was the use of ventilators. Of course, people are on ventilators when a patient is struggling to breathe, they're not able to keep their oxygen level at a certain number, then they need assistance or help with breathing.
Carolyn, I want to set that up for people. You know, we don't hear the word ventilator as much anymore. You remember at the very onset of this, and you and I talked about this weeks ago, and I am one who was critical of the president because he was taking his time, it seemed, in getting the ventilators, and he was disputing with governors over how many ventilators they needed. And what he said was, you know, later we found out the current administration was concerned that the governors were not either tracking their resources properly, or in his words, they were insatiable, they were being greedy. And so I definitely criticized that statement. And I remember him saying, we have all the ventilators we need. And at the time, the news reports, the media was saying, we need New York by itself needed 30,000 ventilators. And the president said, they don't need that much. We'll see if they need it. Now, we do know they ended up not needing that many ventilators. And that story sort of disappeared out of the news. So we'll talk about that, but I want you to give us you always break stuff down for us, Carolyn. Again, explain why did we assume we needed ventilators? Why was that the first course of action?
Well, the first course of action was to put the people on ventilators because the people were struggling to breathe and they were having difficulty breathing on their own. But what was realized was that this particular virus causes inflammation in the airway, so that and when the airway gets irritated or inflamed, to protect itself, it starts leaking a lot of mucus. So just think of, I always explain it to patients, it's like if you're trying to sip a thick milkshake through a straw, okay, you cannot pull that milkshake through the straw as easily as you can pull milk or a soda, because the milkshake is much thicker. So when the mucus plugs up the airway, it's the same thing. So you have to draw in harder to try to pull the air into this airway. Not only is the airway full of mucus, but it's also swollen. So the circular area that air can pass in has shrunk.
Okay.
So you have decreased room for the air to get in and to get out.
That's
and as a result, the person is working harder and harder to breathe.
That's the condition.
They help them by putting them on the ventilator, so that it'll help them kind of overcome that. But what they realized, they eventually realized that if they can kind of clear the mucus and the person can kind of help themselves clear their own mucus, then their oxygen level will improve just by removing the blockage. And then
but does the ventilator clear the passage? Will the ventilator do that work you're talking about? Will it clear?
No, the ventilator can't do that. You have to use something to like thin the secretions and the natural response of the body when there's mucus in the airway is to cough.
Okay, here's
And
why. Carolyn, let me just say, because I want people to understand why we're talking about this in such detail. When everything came out about, and we all were freaking out about ventilators, rightfully so, we did need them. That was the first line of defense originally. I spoke to you about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and you said, Jade, I'm not sure about this ventilator thing. And I said, what do you mean, Carolyn? We need a ventilator. Everybody says we need a ventilator. And this is why I always say we must gather our news from as many sources possible. We must do the research. And you said, I'm concerned, and you have to tell people about your background in not only infectious disease, but in asthma as well. You said, I'm concerned that maybe we're all kind of just drowning a little bit in our own mucus. And I said, well, that's why we need the ventilator. Won't we get on that and it'll help? And you said, that's not what the ventilator does.
No.
That's not what it does.
Right.
So you also said, if that's not what the ventilator does, and the body is still filling up with mucus, then what is essentially actually happening to us?
Okay, well, when you're on the ventilator, of course, you have a tube in your throat that's putting the air in your airway. So the body's naturally response when something is in the throat is to like gag. You know, it's like choke, like when you have a plug some food or something stuck in your throat, you'll choke or gag. So that the person will be able to tolerate being on the ventilator with the tube in their throat, you then have to make sure that the normal responses of gagging or coughing are quieted so that then the ventilator can do its work.
So are we working against ourselves then? Are you saying that if I'm on the ventilator, my lungs are filling with fluid, the ventilator's not really helping me all that much?
No, well, what they found out was that for people who did need ventilators, that if they were to put them face down, what they call proning, that way the fluid didn't build up in their lungs and cause pressure in their lungs, because now they're face down and that relieves the pressure on their back. If you're lying on your back, then the fluid just builds up and increase pressure. And as one pulmonologist was explaining, you just kind of get in a vicious cycle where you need more pressure to get more air in, and that causes more trauma, which causes you to need more pressure, and then you get to a point where you can't get the person off the ventilator because it's like they're just going like a downward spiral. So
one of the things when we were working together on pandemic proofing, you said, Jade, what we really need is some system of ongoing education to educate the frontline workers in real time. Because it's almost like deja vu here. I listen to a lot of international podcasts, and as the virus gets to new nations, it's like I'm hearing old news from months ago, but they're experiencing it brand new from the start, as if they didn't get any of the information that the other nations have gone through. So you said we need a system of ongoing education for healthcare workers so that they're not still using treatments that may no longer be as effective as we thought.
Exactly. Yeah, you can, and that happens all the time where you have like a data bank or something where there's an exchange of ideas, or where people put information to let people know what's working, what's not working, what's effective, what's not effective. And then people can avail themselves of the information, and then they can change their disease management protocols accordingly. Yeah.
So here's the hard thing to say. I said that we would be walking into an era of hard truth. I'm going to say something that's hard to say. I don't mean it to be sensational, but I want to stand by my promise to bring people information at the height of our intelligence. There were medical experts who had concerns early on that maybe ventilators weren't the way to go for everyone, that some people definitely needed it.
Yes.
That we may be making a mistake by putting just everybody when they walk in with low, how do you say it, low blood oxygen.
The oxygen level was low.
That we may be making a mistake. How was that information received when that person was kind of telling people, I think we may need to look at this again?
Well, it seems to me there was a very detailed article in Reuters about a week ago where they interviewed 30 physicians. They were like pulmonologists and then physicians that work in intensive care units, and they were subspecialists. And, there's nuances with lung function and pulmonary mechanics that you really have to understand in order to manage a person properly on a ventilator.
Mm.
And there was concern that there were people who were putting people on ventilators who weren't aware of all those nuances and pulmonary mechanics. So this physician was trying to get the word out. So he actually ended up putting a video on YouTube
Oh, wow.
to try to get the word out, to let people know that, hey, and the one intensive care physician said that he actually called the people what he called happy hypoxics. These
Mm.
were people who had low oxygen level, but they were still able to eat. They were still able to talk. As long as they were not showing that they were having decreased mental function.
Yeah.
But that was what was the decision to put people on ventilators, when they were showing that the low blood oxygen level was now impacting their mental abilities.
Mhm.
Then that was okay, this person needs to be on a ventilator.
So we had to dig for that story. Now
Mhm.
you had your own hypothesis about this,
Mhm.
like I said, 3 or 4 weeks earlier than this started coming out. The
Yeah.
hard truth is this: when this thing gets done,
Mhm.
we may find that there were people who were done a serious, even a grave disservice by being put on the ventilators. Might there be now this issue where people are saying, look, the ventilator might have been the thing that took them out instead of COVID-19? How
Yeah.
likely is that?
Well, that's where your cohort studies would come in.
Mhm.
You look at you would have to pull the charts and look at, see the trends. But the point that was made in this particular article that I referenced in Reuters, the intensive care doctor was saying that what raised the concern was that usually if a person is sick enough to need a ventilator and they go in the intensive care unit, there's like a 50-50 chance that they will survive or they will not.
Here
But
is where
what
Go
they
ahead.
saw in the COVID cases of patients who went on ventilators was that it was like 86 to 88% mortality. And that's what kind of raised the question was,
Hmm.
does everybody who's on a ventilator need to have been on a ventilator?
Here's one of my questions to you was, why are we not seeing this reported more? Why isn't this a louder kind of piece of news to say, hey, we might need to really change course on this thing? It's kind of just gone quiet. And the president says it's because nobody wants to admit that he was able to get enough ventilators. I do predict that at the end of this, he will probably come across the same information as people will come across it. And I think he'll probably go back to and change what he said earlier. And what he'll say now is, see, the reason we didn't need ventilators because they weren't really working like we thought. So it's going to be interesting to watch how the messaging and rhetoric changes.
Yes, it will.
To election. I said to you, we have to be so careful about how we're receiving the information. And the outlets in charge of releasing the information have to be that much more careful, because imagine if all I've been hearing is ventilator is the answer. In my lay knowledge, that's what I think is the cure for COVID-19. So when I go to the hospital, if a family member of mine has COVID-19 and is, whether they're in distress or not, or for whatever reason we're at the emergency room, I'm going to be crying out, give us a ventilator.
Yes.
And so if you had information, I don't think the ventilator is going to work. You're now in a tough place because all I know is ventilator is the only answer. I'm demanding the ventilator.
No, not exactly. As a matter of fact, in the case, there was a case that was exactly what happened to this pulmonologist, the renowned pulmonologist in Germany. And this particular, his patient was a physician. The physician became ill, and he said, you know what? I'm going to the top pulmonary hospital to get treatment. And he was struggling to breathe, and he was having chest pain. And he said he just knew that this pulmonologist would eventually put him on the ventilator. And the pulmonologist explained to him, see, a lot of times I know people will come in and say, why don't you put my relative on a ventilator? But if you explain to people, listen, we know that ventilators are used when people are having trouble breathing. But in this particular case, you need to be able to sit up, cough, and spit the phlegm out. And if you're on a ventilator, you cannot do that. So, I mean, you can suction people, deep suction them or whatever to remove mucus. I'm not saying that you just lie there with mucus on the ventilator.
Sure.
You can suction them and remove the mucus and things like that. But it will require like this particular virus, and a lot of viruses do that. Respiratory syncytial virus is another virus that causes just inflammation in the airway and excessive mucus and production and secretions. So the key is to decrease the secretions. And a lot of times, if you can do that, that alone will help improve the person's ability to get oxygen.
Yeah.
And they won't need the ventilator. So by explaining that to the patient or the family members, then they can understand, oh, okay, now I understand why you're not using it.
I'm just saying it's going to be difficult, Carolyn, because if I'm watching the news 24/7 at the beginning of this, all I know now is that savior equals ventilator.
Right.
And so what one of my concerns is, as we reopen, is, of course, I was talking about with you, what about the possibility of a resurgence? One of the other concerns that I've had that I haven't seen yet covered really in the media is if we don't take the time to do the education you're talking about, to also put in place, for instance, we talked about how restaurants, the same way we have the public, the health department goes in and does an inspection to see if their hygiene is good. We need a system like that to say, okay, this restaurant is cleared now for gathering again. They're following, federal protocols, state guidelines, guidelines, and we want to be able to almost see like a certificate that says it's okay to eat here. They clean the proper way in between. They have the tables socially distanced for however long. We'll do that. And so my concern is that if we don't take the time to put the precautions in place, we're actually putting our businesses at risk of things like litigation. There are people who look for those opportunities as well.
As a matter of fact, that was one of the things that was pointed out in an article, that there could be people who will just say that they contracted the infection there, and they may have already been positive when they get there. So that's a risk also that you would have to kind of try to protect yourself from that also.
Yeah, I think we've drawn such hard lines with words like, liberty. You're infringing on my liberty because I can't leave and do what I want, or I can't go back to my business and make money, which is so important, not just for the jump starting of the economy as a whole, but for every individual's survival.
Yes.
But in the long term, what I want to be sure we're not doing as we reopen again is that we don't set up our citizens and our businesses to be caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yes.
What are your concerns in terms of resurgence? Now, we've changed a little bit. When we first started talking, I had grave concerns about what reopening would look like. And I was saying, look, we've got to know who's sick and who's not. And I hear people always say, virologists always say, if people aren't within proximity, the virus can't spread. But now people are saying, look, being shut down may actually be costing us something where our future health is concerned, where the virus is concerned. Tell us a little bit about why reopening is also important health-wise, because the argument has always been reopening is important for the economy, but it may also be important health-wise. Explain that.
Well, if you have people, 81% of the people who get the infection, the disease is mild. And so these people will then build up antibodies or have immunity. And I know there's a question where they're saying, well, we don't know how long it lasts. We don't know this. But the thing is, if you have immunity, that will slow the spread. Because if you have 10 people and 8 people are immune, then that means when the virus comes around, it has to search for somebody to latch onto, because 8 people out of the 10 are already immune. So those 8 immune people the virus will not be able to latch onto them and start an infection. And then the 2 people who weren't immune won't get the infection because the other 8 people essentially blocked it. So that's how basically it's real basic, but that's how herd immunity works. If you have a large enough people in a certain population that have immunity, then the virus now cannot get started. The infection cannot get started. So even if you do have a small number of people who are not immune, they will not get it because the virus was not able to start in the first place.
So do you think then, I know the Netherlands about a month ago was already kind of doing some herd immunity tests. They had volunteers, about 6,000 volunteers that they were kind of testing on.
Yes.
And here's the thing. When you look at the news coverage of COVID-19, we only hear about the deaths. We're now over 60,000.
Right.
If that's all you hear about, and if you only see, I remember my husband in the beginning would come home telling me about these dreadful cases that had the absolute physical worst case scenario. And I remember saying to him, honey, I don't think that's actually the majority of people who get the virus. But in our head, COVID-19, death. And we don't see a lot of reporting on the recoveries. I said the other night, we've had over 170,000, I think, recoveries. So here's the problem. When we think of going back out and catching the virus, we only think that's an absolutely awful negative thing. It's a death sentence. But you were saying, how should we maybe think about it differently in terms of catching COVID-19?
Catching it?
Yeah, like if we go out and we come, how should we think of it? Is it an absolute death sentence if we get it?
No, the thing is, it's according to the World Health Association statistics, 81% of the cases were mild, and you had 19% people who needed ventilators, and of that 19%, only 5% were critically ill. So when you look at it in those numbers, you even if you get the infection, for the most part, it will be mild. And then now, the thing that we have now that we didn't have 2 or 3 months ago was we have enough experience. We have a antiviral medication that has been effective. We now know to have better protocols and better ways to determine who best would benefit from being on a ventilator. Because the doctor that was in Germany, that he was in the hospital, he was only in the hospital 7 days, and he never went on the ventilator. The doctor gave him oxygen. Now they do give them oxygen with a little nasal cannula. It's just that they don't have to be sedated or put on a ventilator. But
so do you think now that reopening, or put it this way, are we doing ourselves a disservice by staying apart and staying socially distanced? Because we're not allowing ourselves to be able to get to herd immunity faster.
Right, because what will happen is that's going to prolong the basically novel state of the virus.
Okay.
If you don't have people mounting immunity and you don't have increasing numbers of people with antibodies, that's going to allow the virus to continue to be able to infect people. So if you have enough people that have antibodies, and now when the virus tries to attach, it cannot attach and start, because see, what happens is the virus enters a cell and basically like takes over. It's kind of like you have a store and you're selling socks.
Yeah.
And then somebody comes into the store and said, no, you're not selling socks anymore. You are now selling hats. And so the virus takes over, and now you no longer are able to sell your socks. They're in there. You're off in a closet. You've been locked in a closet, and now they're there selling hats in your establishment. So this is basically what happens. The virus comes in and takes over, and then the cells can no longer perform their normal function. And eventually the cells die, and then the virus just like takes over and just runs roughshod with the body. And then, of course, when you don't have normal cellular function, what happens? The body dies.
So, but see, and that's what everybody's fearful of. So when we talk about
what you have to keep in mind is that 81% of the people that did not happen. What happened was they came in use the same example. They
Mhm.
were selling their socks. The people came in
I
and said,
love this
"No, we're
example.
selling hats."
Mhm.
And then you had the bouncers or the armed guards or the security came up and said, "Listen, there's not going to be any hat selling in here. This is a sock store, and you must leave." So that's what the immune system does, basically stops the virus from multiplying. When the virus can multiply, that's when it takes over.
Mhm.
When you stop the virus from multiplying, that's when it's no longer infective. So, and so you can have that from the immune system, and you can also help that by taking like an antiviral medication, which also will stop the virus from multiplying.
So I wonder again, we talk about this education and re-education piece. If the public is more informed about the actual course of the virus, the percentage of what really happens in the majority, you do hear it. News outlets will kind of say it, it's an afterthought and it goes away, and then we focus on the deaths and the more drastic cases or the most heartbreaking cases. It sounds like we need, as a part of the reopening, we need re-education again on the new news, the new information we now have on this virus that's not as novel as it was when it first started. South Korea has been, I've talked about them often, most news outlets do, they've been sort of the model and at least how they initially dealt with it at the onset. I've been so curious to figure out, I knew they had an incredible tracking and tracing system. Remember, I've been telling you all that we need to start thinking about how important privacy is, because we may see some trade-offs in terms of privacy and prevention. And we'll see the two being kind of equated. What are some of the methods that South Korea has been using that's helped them really get a handle on this?
Okay, well, they already had a system in place to kind of track people's credit cards to keep track of for tax purposes and fraud. And their society, most people use like a similar to like kind of like a debit card that we have for all electronic transactions.
Okay.
So in South Korea, they had a system of electronic transactions that they could track people, the mobile phone records they were using, and they also had the surveillance cameras, like, you know, like we have TransStar for the traffic and things like that. So they had three resources to use to track people, so that once they tested a person and gave them a number, then they could say, okay, number 058 was at 6:15 p.m. was at this particular market. How many other people were in that market at the same time that this person was there? And then they contacted all of those people and tested all of those people.
It's intense.
They had, and with it, because see, they had a very bad experience with the Middle Eastern
with SARS,
the MERS, no MERS.
MERS, they had MERS. That's right.
Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. They had a very bad experience with that back in 2015. So, and they actually came up with how you're saying this pandemic proof, the Daniel Plan. That's what they actually did. They actually came up with an organization that said, we need an emergency response system to coordinate. And within 17 days, they had set up a network of 96 labs, private and public, that were running 24 hours a day.
That's right.
They were doing the PCR tests. They were able to get the results out in 5 to 6 hours. And they had 96 drive-by test centers throughout the country. And when people felt symptomatic, they would go there. The person would come out fully in their protective,
fully covered.
That's and right. They would collect the sample. And if the person was positive, they got a phone call, I guess, with instructions on what to do. And if they were negative, they got a text message. And so that way they were able to really keep people separated so that there wasn't a lot of spread of the virus. And that's why they were able to do that. But here you might have people saying, you know, we have civil liberties, you know, and I guess the real key one was that the electronic transactions, all electronic transactions went into a government database. So it was like all government.
They already had it.
So they didn't need anybody's permission. They didn't need a court order. It was already theirs. So that's how they were able to track people in such detail.
I'm going to bring in a question here that goes back to what we were talking about, and it'll also tie with South Korea.
Mhm.
What South Korea didn't do, ISIS, if you're listening, is they never shut down.
No.
Because their testing was so extensive on the front end. But
Yeah.
doesn't that also mean, Carolyn, they didn't develop herd immunity? Did they, because they didn't have people, they quarantined their sick people, and they tested people whether you had symptoms or not, is what I read
Right.
on.
Right.
So they did what we said earlier. You must
Mhm.
know who's sick and who's not.
Mhm.
ISIS is asking, is the reopening a necessary thing in order to build immunity? But there you have South Korea, who never even shut down.
Mhm.
So what do we need in order to reopen? Like, in order to reopen, or in order to have immunity, do you
Mhm.
feel like we need to reopen sooner than later? That's the first question.
Well, I think now is, I mean, I think enough time has passed that we probably just need to go ahead and reopen. The thing is that do we have, so what we can't have a restriction on who can be tested. We can't say,
Yeah.
oh, well, you know, you've only been coughing for 2 hours, or you only, we have to then open it up. The testing has to be, if you have any cold symptoms at all, we need to make sure your cold symptoms are not due to COVID.
Okay.
So we can't restrict the testing and say, unless they fall into this small box, they won't get tested. Because see, what they did, they said that South Korea was testing 20,000 people a day.
That's right. And that, Carolyn, was when we were testing in Texas 125 a day. The
Yeah.
difference was staggering. The president now boasts about testing more than anyone else, but this is, months into it, whereas South Korea was doing this immediately. And I read earlier on that it was within the first 10 days.
10 days.
They had those 100 places set up.
Mhm.
So we're testing. Speaking of tests,
Mhm.
here's where my stance has changed. I want to be transparent about this. My initial hard stance was that we shouldn't be reopening right now, period. We should still be on shutdown. Part of that is not because I don't want to be back at work. My entire livelihood, for the most part, depends on people gathering in large spaces.
Yes.
So it is not doing me any service to stay on shutdown. But one of the reasons that I was against the timing of it is because, first of all, I didn't feel like we had a universally national response. We've watched every state sort of do whatever they thought was okay, which feels like it's state sovereignty. But the head of the UN today said universally we behaved in the same way. Every country did their own thing. And they now feel like if we'd had a more universal response, if we'd had a more universal protocol, we would have seen a lot more deaths. So here's what I stand by. I stand by, in order to reopen, we must have a sufficient amount of tests. We must have testing protocols set up. We have to hire at least 30,000 new hires in the public health system, which we have been kind of defunding slowly anyway. We laid off a lot of people who already know how to test and trace. So first hire them back. And we needed, like I said, about 30,000 new hires just to do the testing and the tracing, similar to what you were talking about in South Korea. Probably not even as sophisticated quite yet, but that's what we would need. So I stand by, we're still underprepared to reopen powerfully and sustainably. And my concern is that if we create a resurgence, which is which could be a very natural occurrence, an organic thing that viruses do. If we do end up in a resurgence, we're still under-equipped and we're better informed, but not as prepared as we could be. Where I change is I'm not as against the timing of the reopening if the protocol were in place. I was against the reopening right now until we had everything. I still stand there in terms of being prepared, but I'm much more flexible now in terms of wanting to get to herd immunity. Is there anything, I'm putting you on the spot now, is there anything we can do to more safely get to herd immunity? Is there like a strategic way we could reopen that risk less lives?
Well, I mean, now they're saying that for example, at restaurants can only have 25% capacity. But the question is, if you're in a restaurant, you can't wear a mask and eat. I mean, that
I hadn't thought about that.
So, I mean, I'm not sure how that's going to work. I mean, But I guess if they have people at the door, at least testing people's temperatures. And that was another thing they pointed out this morning, like the best way to check temperatures. And they were saying to use the temporal artery thermometer, because you can easily just clean the probe with an alcohol swab, and test the next person. But the thing is that you have to make sure your technique is correct. You have to start here and go across like that to get the right reading. I mean, so if you just press it on the person's forehead, that's not the right way to get the reading. So you would need to train people the proper technique to do that in terms of checking temperatures on everyone who comes in.
Someone's saying that they're grateful for a leader who's willing to be flexible, engage the best response as things progress. China is under a lot of scrutiny right now, Carolyn, because they released numbers of their death figures earlier on, and then they released new figures, which were almost double the amount. And people said, see, we knew they were hiding something. But when we dug, we found out that they changed the diagnosis process 7 times as they learned about the novel virus. And once they got to, let's say, that 7th time, what they learned was, wait a minute, this means that this many more probably actually
already had it. Exactly.
So it wasn't that it was necessarily a cover-up. I do believe, when we've talked about it before, China has some things to answer for. But I do want to explain this kind of process of new numbers and why those numbers might change. Tell us again, for those joining later, about what it is to work with a novel virus and how you think we need to be studying and releasing information or changing our tactics as we go.
Well, as they learn about the virus and what because see, you also, when you test people, you have what's called people who might be false negative. So you test somebody and they have all the symptoms and signs. You say, something, I know this person must have this. And then you do the test and it comes back, for whatever reason, it comes back negative. But that's what's called a false negative, because when you do a test to confirm it, say, for example, you do the rapid test and it comes back negative. But you do the rapid test because the culture takes longer.
Okay.
So by the time you get the culture result in, you'll say, oh, this person, we thought they were negative, but now that we have the culture result back, they actually did grow virus. So they were in fact positive, even though we initially thought they were negative. And that's another way that you can have a low number and then the number ends up being higher when you get confirmatory tests, or you get because see, a culture takes long. You have to wait for the actual virus to grow. So you don't, if you're trying to, it's just like when you go to the doctor and you get a rapid strep test. Your throat is on fire, you have a fever, everything, and they do the rapid strep test and it comes back negative. But they said, something, because you have this high fever, your throat is red, we're going to send a culture to see if any bacteria grow. And then 2 days later, you get a call from the doctor's office. You know what? The culture actually came back positive.
Okay.
So sometimes the same way that happens, and I know many people have probably had that experience with a rapid strep test, and then the culture exactly comes back positive. But you have to wait 24, 48 hours to see if bacteria will grow.
Yeah.
So you will get with as the disease prevalence increases, as more and more people have the disease, when you have a test, you will have more true positives. But what happens is, because you're trying to make sure you don't miss anybody, sometimes you can get like a false negative.
And I think the issue we have to be concerned about is, in that false negative, you got 24, you got 48 hours that you're thinking you're free.
That somebody could be spreading disease. This is true.
So
but that was the other thing that I read also that South Korea did, that even if you tested negative, I think, but if you had symptoms or something, you still were required to self-quarantine for 14 days.
Yeah. We're going to end up having a whole other session, Carolyn, about privacy and protection.
Yes.
Where that balance is going to be. Americans need to be thinking about it now.
Yes.
Paying attention to what nations like South Korea are doing,
Mhm.
because we're already talking about immunity passports here. That's another discussion.
Yeah.
People who are anti-vaccine.
Yes.
You said something very powerful. You said, look, they have the right
Mhm.
not to take the vaccine,
Right.
but they don't have a right
To infect other people. Yes.
And so these are hard discussions that
Yeah.
we're going to be having soon. Let me end by, for anyone joining late, I promise to be transparent as I evolve on these issues, which we must demand that kind of transparency and evolution and leadership. What we're seeing right now from many nations, not just our own, not many, from a few nations, not just our own, is we're seeing people take a hard stance. And because they've either rallied a base around this stance or they've gone public with that stance, they're not flinching in certain areas. They're moving ahead in ways that are not safe because they had a stance and they don't want to look like they got it wrong. This is not about being right or wrong. This is about being right on time for the American people. We have to change in order to create the change that's needed to protect as many people as possible. So if you're just tuning in, I'm having a transformative moment of transparency here and saying, I still believe that in order to reopen powerfully, there are measures that we do not yet have in place. But if we had those measures, I would be okay with reopening right now. My prior stance was, even if we had them right now, I still felt like it was too early. I still felt like there was the danger of the spread. And now, of course, we've known about herd immunity all along. But now when we take that into greater account, if we had everything we needed, we're able to test and then have a protocol for businesses as they open so that we're not endangering them more than we think. And if we were able to powerfully keep tabs on how this virus really was going through the community, I'd be more open to reopening sooner. But again, the protocols, the protection, the testing have to be in place. That has not changed. We're getting closer, Carolyn. I did see reports that the testing has ramped up now.
Yes.
You've seen that? Yeah, we're going to take credit for that because we're going to take credit. Everybody's ramping up now because we were saying the nation only was doing 150,000 tests a day. Experts were saying we need to be doing 500,000 to 1.5 million a day. We're still not quite there, but I am so thankful that our leadership in some ways is taking testing more seriously. Their open stance about it is still flimsy. They won't really admit that we need testing. President Trump will say, some think we do and some think we don't. All medical experts say we need testing. Any closing words for you, Carolyn? How should we, when we talk about faith,
excuse me.
No. How do we exercise faith over fear now with new information? What would that look like for us now?
Well, just make sure that you're in your best health possible. Of course, stick to things like hand washing. If you feel symptoms, probably address them sooner as opposed to later.
Yeah. I'm sorry, you got something in your throat.
Do things like, if your throat is scratchy, change your toothbrush immediately. People don't realize that the toothbrush can be the source of reinfection.
Oh, wow.
I tell people all the time, you go to bed, you wake up the next morning, you feel better. You brush your teeth with that contaminated toothbrush. And by noon, you're going, what happened? I'm getting a relapse because you reinfected yourself with your toothbrush. So if you have a scratchy throat, little tingling in your nose, you know how you feel when you feel like a cold is coming on, that's when you want to immediately change your toothbrush.
Wow.
I buy a lot of toothbrushes. And when I feel, and during cold and flu season, and I feel that little scratchy sensation, I may use my toothbrush once and discard it.
Wow.
So if you have a real fancy, high-powered, nice electric toothbrush, then you might want to table that for right now and just use regular toothbrushes until you're sure that your symptoms have cleared, and then you won't reinfect yourself. So that's one good thing you could do. And then I just caution people that hand sanitizer was never a substitute for washing your hands.
Yes.
And people should really make hand washing is not that tedious and not that much of an inconvenience.
Yeah.
That and anyway, most people who use hand sanitizer are even using that improperly because you're supposed to rub your hands together for like 20 seconds.
Wow.
And people just do 1 or 2 swipes and then they just go on about their business. And then the other thing that gets me is when you're in a restaurant at a table with 20 people and everybody's passing the same hand sanitizer. No.
Yeah.
So I think simple things like that will help protect you.
That's good.
As we, go back, kind of start a reopening, just do things like that. Be aware of your body's symptoms, and when you feel that scratchy throat, that little tingling, feel like you might have a fever, you want to check that immediately and address it immediately.
We have one last question. Are there any natural antiviral supplements that you would suggest?
Well, in terms of an antiviral supplement, there's not. I know there is a medication that's it is homeopathic. It's called oscillocosinem, and that's for the influenza symptoms. But then there's also another made by the same company. It's called Cold Calm, and that is also, both of these are designed to kind of boost your immune system to like help it fight the infection and kind of head it off at the pass before it could get started. So they're available. I mean, I've seen oscillocosinem is even at Walmart. I mean, it's everywhere.
I'm just excited to hear somebody.
You might have to go to like either like a health food store or someplace like Whole Foods or something like that. A natural food store would have it, but oscillocosinem is everywhere. Everywhere.
I'm just happy to hear somebody actually pronounce it, because we buy it, but none of us know how to say it. Say it one more time.
Oscillocosinem.
All right. Yeah. My assistant Takira, I know, is listening, because we just call it Oxa. You know what I'm talking about. And then we stop. So now
it really does help. I can remember patients that have influenza, and even I gave them Tamiflu, and if they had all the body aches, and I said, something, you might want to try this along with that.
Okay.
And they tell me, oh, something. I mean, this one lady, every time she sees me now, she's like, oh, I've been telling everybody about oscillocosinem.
Yeah.
But it does. It makes you, it really, you do feel much better when you take it.
Well, Carolyn, I always feel much better when I talk to you. I learn
well, thank you.
So many things from you, and you have such a knack for helping us understand simply some of the most complicated things that we're facing. I asked, how do we practice faith over fear? And really, knowledge is so powerful to add with our faith. Faith is not an excuse not to know, or not to understand, or not to think. We're given a sound mind, right?
Yes,
and so we should use it. So thank you so much for the information you've given us tonight. That's going to conclude our debrief for tonight. I hope that this has been informative. I am downright addicted to having people learn something they didn't learn, so that they can make bolder moves than they made before. And wisdom, prudence, information is so crucial to that. You can expect that in any type of leadership that I would like to offer. I'm running for president of the United States because I believe we now need an entirely new lane of experience, that we are now not in need of people who just have political ties, who are going to come to the table with lopsided agendas. We need now a leader on a mission. And my mission right now is to restore the nation to a place where we are one nation, under God and indivisible. We cannot beat COVID divided. The only way that we truly recover and have a sustainable recovery is if we unify now. How do we unify? We need the same information. We need the same instruction. Yes, we may have to modify it for our cities, modify it for our state, but we have to start from a place where we know we are all on the same page and that we are fighting for the same common goal. That is to not just survive this thing, but to thrive through it. And what that means is we don't get to just wish this away without taking the proper precautions. We don't get to just think that we're great because our name is America. There is greatness in our identity. I believe in that. I believe that every nation comes with its own unique identity, its own unique set of personality traits. But I think we have to take ownership of those things. That, you know, being a maverick, being an independent nation that we are, and operating the way that we do, gives us the liberty and the freedom to do things well, right? So we have to not get caught up in personal liberty, in a sense that we don't care about the well-being of our brothers and sisters, our neighbors all around us. And so I'm excited to lead a new era, to usher in a new normal, which I think is exciting. We get to anticipate doing things better than we did before. I dare say, and I'll end with this, that it will be a travesty. It's a disservice to the people who have lost their lives during COVID-19 if we come out of this doing things how we always did them, looking exactly the same. We owe it to them to level up. And I'll end there. If you're interested more in what we're doing at Operation Restoration and you want to be a part of restoring the nation, you're going to text RESTORE to 33777. We have all sorts of ways for you to activate your purpose and be a part of really trailblazing a new era of American history. I'm excited by the possibilities ahead, and even more excited to work alongside you to attain them. Thank you so much for joining in. Check out OperationRestoration2020.com and keep your eyes on everything we're doing for the month of May. This is a month of momentum. We're excited for the things that are coming and excited for you to be a part of them. And we are so grateful, so thankful for how so many of you have supported us and helped us spread the message. If you see things that resonate with you, be it a social media post, a video, please share it. That's the best way you can help us right now, and share it with intention. Let people know what parts of the message are resonating with you, what parts of the vision that we lay out match yours. Let them know if our heartbeat is sounding a lot like yours. That would be the greatest blessing ever. Okay, have an amazing weekend. Enjoy your families, and we'll see you on Sunday for the rally cry at 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Have a good night.